Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with Dr. Jaswal, who's going to share a bit about his research and work on facilitated communication and non-speaking autistic individuals. So my first question is really just, how did you become interested in studying this area?
Well, thanks, Sam, for having me. And to be clear, I think just to set the stage, facilitated communication, or FC, is one kind of approach that people use to communicate if they're not able to use speech. But I prefer to use the term assisted forms of communication because it encompasses more than that particular method. Maybe we can talk about some of the differences later. But in terms of how I got interested in trying to understand and support folks who can't rely on speech to be understood. Well, I had one really transformative experience happened maybe, I guess it would have been about 10 years ago now, 2015 or thereabouts, when a speech language pathologist that I know, Elizabeth Vossler, she was running a summer institute for young adult, non-speaking autistic folks. And the Summer Institute would have people of various professions come in for a few days or part of a week and, you know, chat with the non-speaking folks about the work that they did and get involved in some activities and so on. And so Elizabeth asked me if I would be interested in coming to talk about research about autism. And, I knew a little bit about autism. I didn't know a lot, but I knew some about autism, but I certainly had never spent any time with a group of non-speaking autistic people. And that opportunity, I think it lasted 3 or 4 afternoons. It was just remarkable. It was really transformative. Um, One of the things that stands out was, you know, I came in with a lot of assumptions. I mean, I came in with my PowerPoint slides and I didn't know what to expect. And so, you know, one of the things I thought we might start out doing in that time was to talk about what is research and what is an independent variable? What is a dependent variable? What is a manipulation like? And the kinds of things that, I, in the field that I work in psychology, like think a lot about and certainly have experience teaching other people about. Um, and one thing that was very clear immediately is like a lot of this information was familiar to this group of, 10 non-speaking young adults. Um, and at a certain point, like we transitioned to talking about research in autism because that's what they were interested in. And as you probably know, like a lot of the research in autism is pretty much gloom and doom. It's all about what autistic people can't do. And it focuses a lot on deficits, in quotation marks, that autistic people are said to have. And it can be a really depressing thing to even dip your toe into. But I mean, this is the history of the field. So I thought, well, let's start by talking about a classic study in autism science about theory of mind. And theory of mind is this umbrella term that refers to the ability to recognize that other people have beliefs, thoughts, desires, goals, and so forth that may be different from your own. So to recognize that you have mental states that motivate your behavior and other people have mental states that motivate their behavior, and these mental states are unobservable, but they may be in conflict. So anyway, there's a pretty old but very influential and I think really problematic study done in the 80s, where the researchers were interested in the question. I think the title of the paper is like, does an autistic child have a theory of mind? And so the researchers were interested in investigating whether autistic kids in this particular case could reason about another person's goals. And so the study that was run, is a classic study that's also done with young children, typically developing kids. And it involves showing that there are two dolls. One doll puts her marble or ball into a basket and then leaves the room. And the second doll moves the ball from the basket into a box. And the first doll comes back. And the question asked to the participant is, where will this doll, Sally, where will she look for her ball? And right, to answer this question correctly, you have to recognize that because she was out of the room at the time that the ball was moved from the basket to the box, Sally will have a false belief about where the ball is. So the correct answer is to say that Sally will look for the ball in the basket because that's where she thinks it is. She has a false belief. Well, it turns out that in this study, you know, only about 20% of the autistic, I think they were 12-year-olds, passed this task. Only about 20% of them said that Sally would look for the ball in the basket where she left it. The other 80% said she'd look for it in the box. They made what's called the reality error. Anyway, from this classic study, it's spun out. I mean, it's been cited thousands of times, and a lot of interest was invested in, and resources were invested in trying to demonstrate that what autistic people lack that's responsible for the constellation of challenges and strengths that they have is the ability to reason about other people's mental states. And this is clearly problematic, as I said at the outset, because you talk to autistic people, and this is not something that a lot of autistic people say they have difficulty with. Um, and furthermore, of course, there are problematic features of the experimental setup itself. Like maybe Sally's a tricky kind of doll, and Anne, the other doll, knows about that. And so, like, she moves it to the other location, but then, of course, anyway, you get the point. Like, there are lots of reasons why somebody could make a reality error other than the fact that they can't reason about somebody's false belief. Anyway, so I presented this study to the non-speaking autistic young adults in this summer institute, and I asked them for some comments, and they all to a person all thought it was not a very well done study, and they were really concerned that the 12-year-old autistic kids were being compared to 3-year-old typically developing kids because that was one of the 4-year-old non-autistic kids. So they were offended by some things, and they also just thought it wasn't really a very good way to demonstrate that somebody knows that another person has beliefs, thoughts, goals, and desires that can differ from their own, or that motivate their behavior. So I said, well, it's good to be critical, but it's also good to think about, like, well, if you're interested in investigating whether an autistic person can reason about somebody else's goals, like, what kind of experiment would you like to see? And so we're sitting there, and one guy, he spells out, because these young adults all communicate by pointing to letters on a letter board held vertically by a trained communication and regulation partner. So he spelled out, um, oh, if I wanted, I said, so what would you do if you wanted to, investigate questions about theory of mind in autistic people? I said, he spelled out, I would conduct a study that has a video of somebody about to go into a bathroom. And I would stop the video at the point before he went in, and I would ask the participant, what is he about to do? Right? Because if somebody can reason about another person's goals or intentions, they would be able to recognize that the person is going to the bathroom probably because he needs to use the bathroom. I thought, wow, that's pretty, that's great. That's, you're absolutely right. That's a good way to illustrate that somebody might have an understanding of another person's goals. They are reasoning about another person's behavior on the basis of what they think his underlying mental states are. So I thought, that's great. And then I think it must have been about 5 or 10 minutes later, where the conversation had kind of moved on. And there's a kid, a young man, jumping around the back of the room. And, he was wearing headphones, and I didn't know whether he was attending to what was going on, right? As my own ableist assumptions. I didn't have any idea, but he waves his hand and spells out, if I were a subject in so-and-so's experiment, I'd want to know whether the actor who was about to go into the bathroom was autistic. And I said, well, why would you want to know that? And he explained, well, because if he was autistic, maybe he was going into the bathroom because he needed a sensory break, not because he needed to, use the bathroom to relieve himself. And I was just like, whoa, I was blown away. Like here we have a non-speaking autistic person not just reasoning about theory of mind, but reasoning about the beliefs of an actor in an experiment that hadn't even ever been done. And I just I was really taken aback and thought, wow, this is remarkable. And um, a couple of other experiences during that week led to similar kinds of feelings. And I remember sort of um, every day on my drive home, calling up whoever I could think of and trying to describe to them this experience that I had had. And so, in the course of that uh, summer institute, it also became clear that all these folks who spell by pointing to letters like they are absolutely familiar with and know about some of the challenges that this method of communication presents, particularly because of critics who insist, and I know we're going to come to this later, that what they're spelling isn't coming from themselves. And so, I spent some time trying to think about how I could use the skills that I have as a psychologist, as a cognitive scientist, to um, address some questions that were of interest to that community. And so that's kind of where much of this began.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer and background and for, I guess, sharing some of the ideas for alternative experiments on theory of mind. That's pretty interesting. The next question is a little bit of a jump in topic, but I know you discussed this in one huge barrier that we're going to get to in the rest of the questions, which is just kind of doubt about uh, this type of communication overall. But what are some other barriers that individuals who use assistive communication might encounter that those of us who are speaking or primarily speaking might not be aware of? I know naively sometimes there's this idea of like, okay, if we just make AAC available, then that's kind of all we have to do to be accessible. And I'm sure that's probably not a fully complete mindset.
Well, I do think that access to communication is key. So that is, you're absolutely right. That's essential and something I know we're going to talk a lot about. Um, but to be honest, Sam, I mean, I think that a lot of assumptions get made about people who don't speak. Um, I think that people who don't speak are assumed maybe not to understand. They're assumed perhaps not to have much going on up there, not to care about the way that they're treated or the ways others treat them, not to have preferences. They're not treated as fully human. I mean, uh, a form of dehumanization is, denying complex emotions and thoughts to other organisms. And I think that speech, for really unfortunate reasons, is used as a proxy for whether somebody is able to, for how much competence somebody has. And you see this, of course, with non-speaking people, not just non-speaking autistic people, but non-speaking people, people who have with CP, for example, or people who have ALS, or people who are, I mean, they're or people who speak a language other than English if you're in an English speaking country. So lots of assumptions are made about people who are unable to communicate effectively using speech. And the consequences of those assumptions are astounding and they're devastating. And they include everything from the kinds of educational opportunities somebody's offered to, of course, the kinds of employment opportunities to the kinds of social opportunity. I think um, it's not just a matter of providing people means of communication, although, as I said, that is absolutely essential. But I think until we figure out a way to help change attitudes about the multitude of ways in which people communicate, and recognizing that there are lots of effective ways to communicate other than speech, and the lack of speech does not indicate a lack of language or a lack of ability to engage in complex thinking, and so on. Like that's really going to be that's a hurdle that we, in addition to providing people with access to communication, we have to be able to get over.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And I completely agree that I guess, dehumanization or negative assumptions about people who don't speak to communicate is such a, I guess, critical human rights issue in a lot of ways. Um, The next question is kind of going back to, I guess, the objections or criticism about facilitated communication or assistive communication that you mentioned earlier. I know there is a lot of criticism out there. I think Wikipedia currently, well, for what that's worth, Wikipedia denotes it as a pseudoscience. Asha has put out a kind of cautionary statement about it. And then there are some research articles like message passing tests that, as a layperson, do seem not promising about it. But I guess I was wondering, I know you've also done a lot of studies that show promise for facilitated communication, which I'm eager to hear about in the next few questions. But I'd love to hear, I guess, your response to claims that facilitated communication is already discredited or debunked. Kind of whether you initially had any skepticism towards facilitated communication yourself, or if you feel like there's kind of any widespread errors or flaws in how these research studies are set up. And I think the last sub question I have under here, so I know I have a lot of sub questions under this particular one, but have there been successful instances of message passing tests that have maybe been overlooked as well?
Well, you're right, there's a lot, a lot in there. Um, well, let's start with prior to having the opportunity to get to know and interact with non-speaking people who communicate in alternative ways, did I know anything about FC? Or, FC is one kind of method that some people use in order to communicate, and it's different from some of the other methods. And without getting too far in the weeds, I think I absolutely was aware of the critics of FC because I'm trained as a psychologist, and experimental psychologists spend a lot of time figuring out what are the best ways to um, control for various factors that may be influencing data that are not of interest to you. So, um, and in probably every research methods or experimental methodology, statistics kinds of courses that people take, there's probably discussion of the famous case of Clever Hans. So Clever Hans was a horse in Germany who apparently was able to do arithmetic. And it was quite a party trick. And it was remarkable to see a horse who could do addition, for example, or subtraction. I don't know whether it got to division or not, but it could apparently do a lot of mathematical operations. And um, the people were astounded, like how could a horse know that 5 + 2 = 7? And the way it would make its response is by tapping its hoof apparently like 7 times if it was given a problem on a chalkboard 5 + 2. Um, and so some scientists at the time, psychologists, the equivalent of psychologists at the time, generated a way to test Hans's abilities. And the way they did that was by either removing the owner from the venue where the questions were being asked, or putting a screen in front of him or something. And they found that Hans was not able to respond correctly to these mathematics questions when he didn't have access to his owner. And I don't think it was the case that the owner was intentionally guiding Hans to tap his hoof a number of times, but unconsciously, or maybe through some kinds of unintentional means, he was, I don't know exactly what the cues were, but maybe nodding his head when he got to 7 in the particular case that I was just describing, or, furrowing his brow, or I don't know what. And somehow Hans was responding to these cues. It became clear from the owner or the trainer. Um, and so like that is held up as an example of why it's so important in experimental psychology to make sure that you are controlling for a whole bunch of variables that could influence your data, even if that was not the thing of interest. Um, and so I was absolutely familiar with that. And then in the textbooks, generally speaking, the controversy about facilitated communication comes up, and the kinds of tasks that are used to discredit facilitated communication include like the only one that I can think of right now is message passing test, the thing you were describing, which is on its face seems pretty straightforward. So what if you show a picture, let's say, of one kind of thing to the facilitator and a picture of something else to the user, to the person who's typing. And the facilitator, to be clear, in FC is providing backward resistance at the wrist or the elbow or the shoulder, or sometimes just touching the person on the back. Um, what if you showed a picture of one thing to the facilitator and a different picture to the user, and you ask the user to explain what they saw? Well, what the results of many of those studies showed was that either gibberish was produced typed, or sometimes the name of the picture that the facilitator saw was typed. And so, like on its face, that seems like, oh my goodness, that's difficult to figure out. Well, I mean, until you recognize that this is a bizarre situation to be put in. This is a task that to people who have always had access to a way to communicate and to share what they know seems trivial. But to people who have had very different experiences, in some cases, maybe haven't had any way to express what they know until they've been given access to this method of communication. Like that's just you got to think about what the context in which these kinds of tests are being given is like for somebody who hasn't had a lot of experience with communication. That's kind of relevant because it turns out that people who practice this message passing, there is some research, published research, showing that they can improve over the course of time. They can get better at reporting the picture that they saw, for example. Um, and then, I think another piece, I think you raised this in one of your notes to me, like there is a lot of anxiety that probably people who know that they're being tested in some way are going to experience when they're faced with this kind of situation. And so, I mean, I think that these kinds of issues haven't been taken seriously, and this particular kind of test, this message passing test, has been used as the gold standard for discrediting this method of communication, facilitated communication. And I think that the findings from that kind of test should be taken seriously. But, you know, for all the reasons that I've just said, there are lots of reasons why people may not succeed on a task. Our job should be to try to figure out whether the tasks are problematic, whether there are other ways to assess their knowledge. I mean, just because somebody is not able to do something in the same way that everybody else is able to do it doesn't mean that, the underlying construct is bunk. So anyway, I think that addresses a couple of the sub-questions that you raised. Um, and sort of the turn that we've used in my lab is to think about some alternative ways that you could ask questions about authenticity and about agency that don't require these kinds of uh, tasks that were not designed for the people that you're testing them on. Just to put a pin in, or put a close on this, like the history of psychology is littered with examples of psychologists who create and norm a task or test in one culture, taking that same task or test and attempting to use it in a different culture and finding that people of that other culture, they fail, they can't do it. Now, does that mean that those folks don't have the competence to do whatever it was that was being tested? No, not necessarily. It means that they may not have been able they may not have been tested in a way that would allow them to demonstrate what they know. And like this is a fundamental principle of cognitive science, this distinction between competence and performance. So for folks who, the example I often think of is like, if I, measured your ability to play tennis the day after you broke your arm, it wouldn't matter how good of a tennis player you were. You were like the performance limitations would prevent you from demonstrating your competence. And I think, a fundamental aspect, principle in cognitive science is this performance competence distinction. Our goal as scientists should be to try to develop ways to assess what people know that won't be affected by performance limitations.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I appreciate it. And I guess the next question is kind of about some of these alternative methods other than the message passing test. So I know that you've developed some studies that I think do use, potentially better or more accessible methods, like studies on eye tracking. And I believe one study that uh, had respondents press pulsating letters or characters to kind of distinguish whether the characters corresponded to a real sentence or a nonsense sentence. So, yeah, I guess would you be willing to describe these studies a little bit more and maybe how you developed them and what the results are and kind of what you think the implications of these studies would be?
Sure. I mean, we can start with the eye tracking work. Um, in general, people tend to look at targets before they interact with them. So if I'm going to reach for my glass of water, I will look at it and then move my hand toward it. And that's because, for sighted people, our ability to accurately perform the motion, the action that's going to get us that glass of water is going to be much more precise and much more calibrated if I've had a chance to look at it first. So in general, people tend to look at things before they interact with them. Um, a second important sort of piece of background is that in general, our ability to respond to external cues in the environment is limited. So like you might, I don't know, provide me with a cue to look in a particular direction, and I can do it. First, I have to detect that cue, like you might point in a particular direction. I have to detect that cue, see you point, and then I have to interpret it. Oh, he wants me to look in that direction. And then I have to perform the action. So, like, there are limits on the human information processing system in terms of how quickly we would be able to respond to a cue from the external environment. So, we took these two things, the fact that people tend to look at things before they interact with them, and the fact that there are limits on the information processing system in terms of how quickly we can respond to external cues. And we developed a study, which was really the opportunity to investigate in the wild how people who have experience pointing to letters on a letterboard held vertically by a trained communication regulation partner, like when they're doing the spelling that they do routinely, like how quickly and accurately are they spelling? And we got a group of 9 non-speaking autistic folks who communicate in this way, and they'd had at least 2 years of experience spelling in this way. And we measured how quickly they pointed to letters and where their eyes were and how quickly they looked at various letters and what the relationship was between where they were looking and where they were pointing. And the short story is that we argued that people were looking and pointing at letters much too quickly for their performance to be a result of external cues or cues coming from the trained communication regulation partner. So, for example, they were spelling about 1 letter per second, and their eyes were preceding their point to each letter by about half a second, by about 500 milliseconds on average. And, you know, if you think about, if you try to take seriously some of the critics' suggestions that, well, maybe the communication and regulation partner is moving the board slightly in such a way to indicate where the user should point. Well, there are 26 letters on a letter board, 26 letters of the alphabet, and like somebody would have to interpret what this little what some move means in order to know, oh, I need to go from the, from the A to the Y in this case. And like the speed with which the participants in our study were spelling was just too fast for that to be possible. We also identified a couple of patterns in the both in the pointing and the eye tracking data that are um, sort of reminiscent of or actually analogous to psycholinguistic patterns that you see non-autistic typers typing. Like those studies were done for entirely different reasons, but like you see the same patterns in the data from the autistic folks as you do from these non-autistic people typing. And so it's just an example, like the pairs of letters are called bigrams, and there's a certain likelihood that two letters will, like one letter will follow another. So that's called bigram frequency. So for example, I don't know, RF is much less common than DS, right? And so we were able to demonstrate that just like non-autistic typers, these spellers were faster to produce bigrams the more frequent those bigrams were in the English language, suggesting that they had internalized some of the orthography or some of the spelling rules of the English language. Anyway, so from those kinds of data, we argued that the participants in our study were agentically selecting the letters that they pointed to. They were producing sentences that they intended to, and that the speed and accuracy with which they responded suggested that it couldn't be the result of cueing from the communication and regulation partner. That's not to suggest that influence from another person doesn't ever take place. Like right now we're having this conversation, Sam, and like you're back channeling very helpfully to me, so I feel comfortable continuing. You're not frowning. If you were, then I would probably readjust and try to explain something in more detail. um, and so influence is part of communication, and sometimes, when you're in a close relationship, somebody will finish your sentence. In some couples, that's a good thing. In some couples, it's not, not such a good thing. But, so that's part of the way communication works. And so, yes, influence is always a possibility. But, I think, and so to be clear, one needs to take seriously the possibility that somebody's being led to say something that they don't want to say. Um, and that is absolutely something that you have to be vigilant against. But to suggest that we need to throw the whole method of communication that's effective for some people out because there's a risk of this doesn't seem appropriate to me, given the data that I just described.
Yeah, thank you so much for describing your study and yeah, for that distinction between like not throwing out the whole I guess possibility of communication because of some potential cases. I had kind of a separate question, which I think you've already addressed quite well. But when I was reading the paper, it seemed like the facilitators in the study also, is it true that they hadn't met the participants prior to the study?
Well, in the eye tracking study, the person who was supporting the individual by holding the communication regulation partner, that individual was familiar to all the participants in various ways. In some cases, they saw her regularly, and in some cases, they saw her every month or every 6 months or something like that. But she was familiar to all of them. But you raise an interesting point. Like if you were to use somebody who was unfamiliar, then the kinds of cues that if we're going to take the cueing explanation seriously, then the kinds of cues that new person provides may not match the cues that the old person provides. So you should see a decrement in performance, maybe that would fall apart entirely. But in fact, plenty of non-speaking autistic people who communicate in these ways, including those in the study that I just described, they interact with lots of different people who serve as communication and regulation partners. There's this balance between the experimental rigor that we want to have, like as we were talking about a moment ago, but also like we want not to put people in a position where they're just meeting somebody for the first time and now they're expected to undergo this. We tried to make it as natural as possible, but this situation which could be somewhat stressful or anxiety producing. So the person who assisted in the case of the study I described, she was familiar to all the participants.
Yeah, so I guess my next question is just what would you like to see for future directions regarding facilitated or assistive communication research?
Well, there are so many important questions to be addressed that I don't quite know where to begin. I think one of the things that people in the community have expressed repeatedly is their desire to gain more independence in the ways that they communicate. So to be clear, like all the assisted methods of communication that I know of, the goal is always for the person to be able to communicate independently by typing or by pointing to letters or using an iPad. And this stage where they are supported by a communication and regulation partner is important, essential for them to get to the point where they're independent. But there is a great deal of interest because if we could get more people to be independent, then this would kind of allow us to move beyond these debates about whether these methods of communication are actually effective or not. So to be clear, there are people who have spent many years communicating with various kinds of support and assistance who now type independently, nobody touching them, nobody holding anything, and so on. And so these are the examples of how it's possible to go from requiring a lot of support to requiring much less support. Now, I also want to emphasize that just because somebody requires much less support in terms of the particular communication method that they're using, they still can benefit from a supportive person to help them regulate emotionally and to help them get back on task when their attention is diverted and so forth, right? So we can all benefit from various kinds of support, but there is an interest in the community of trying to gain more independence when it comes to communication in particular. So I think trying to understand like what is it? What kinds of um, practice methods are most helpful to allow somebody to go from needing more to needing less support? It would absolutely be essential. I think there's some interest. I'm involved with a group at the University of Calgary, for example, where we're trying to leverage technology to try to understand whether we could gamify some of the kind of boring tasks that people might still benefit from, even though they're boring, by getting more practice in communicating. We use augmented reality, as I said, because it seems to be a very appealing kind of technology and because it allows for the kind of hyper customization that for a particular user, you could make things, look a particular way. You could make the sound, unique to that individual user and so on. So that's one area of research that I think is going to be important and exciting. I mean, I think trying to understand this trajectory of how somebody goes from needing more support to needing less support is really important and would have a real um, positive benefit for lots of other people who are trying to get to needing less support too. Some people take, years or decades to get to a point where they're able to communicate effectively without as much support. And, I think different people try lots of different things, and, a decade or more is a long time. And so pinpointing the exact things that somebody is doing that allows them to get there is going to be hard, but, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to figure out those kinds of things. I think some of that could be done by retrospective video analysis, for example. So some people have taken video at various points regularly over the course of their experience and trying to understand what kinds of things were helpful to get them to the point where they are now. I think also like asking non-speaking autistic people who now communicate less with less support, like, what do you think was important to get you there? They might not be able to put their finger on it. I mean, like if you ask me, how did I learn to read? I don't really have a sense of how I was able to do it, but I'm able to perhaps reflect back and come up with some domains or some areas that were helpful. We know that one thing that's absolutely essential, for example, for somebody to be able to become more literate, somebody who communicates in alternative ways, is we know absolutely that the support of the people around them and the presumption of competence in their ability to access, to acquire literacy is absolutely essential. And we know that because well, it may seem kind of obvious, but it's also like because that's what the people who use these methods of communication have told us. So those are a couple of different domains that I think call out for research. I think, only within the last, 10 or 20 years have autistic folks been invited to participate in setting the priorities for research in autism. And here I'm talking not just about non-speaking autistic people, but autism generally. And boy, we've learned so much in the last 10 or 20 years about autism. I said I came to this space pretty recently in the last 15 years or so. And but I was also exposed to the dark and doomy, gloomy sort of things. And that's not to suggest that there aren't challenges associated with autism, but we also know that autistic people think in very different ways from non-autistic people. We know that they feel things in very different ways. And so I think that's also such an interesting and important and valuable part of what this enterprise could yield is like a way to um, bring non-speaking autistic people to the table to ask questions that are of interest to them and to try to better understand what their phenomenological experiences are like, even outside of the communication domain. Something I'm really excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that answer. And yeah, I agree that the studies you mentioned about understanding kind of the trajectory of someone's communication sound really interesting. And I look forward to hopefully reading about that when you're finished with those studies. My last kind of main question is, so I guess it's sort of a disclaimer. My tentative perspective, as again, very much a layperson, at least relative to this particular topic, is that, you know, I guess in the presence of potentially ambiguous evidence, I think the risk of disbelieving someone's genuine communication is more harmful than the converse. I can't really imagine what it would be like for someone, like if every time I want to get water, for example, if I have to prove that it's really me or
Mhm.
have people doubting if I actually need water or if someone persuaded me to say that, that would be pretty exhausting over time, I think. And so I guess I was wondering if you've noticed any ways in which this belief or skepticism may be impacting the well-being of individuals who use assistive communication to communicate.
Oh my goodness, Sam, what a good question and so important. We started out the conversation thinking about the many ways other than access to communication that non-speaking people may run into challenges and talking about the assumptions that they face. And I think it absolutely weighs very heavily on non-speaking autistic people who have, after years of not being able to communicate effectively using speech and having been, in many cases, like forced to attempt to speak, even though they can't, even though that's something they can't do. I mean, you wouldn't say to somebody who uses a wheelchair, just get up, just walk. Like this is a disability that somebody has, and our priority needs to be providing them access to the best method of communication that works for them at this point in time. And of course, we should always be looking for better, more effective ways for them and others like them to communicate. So, in answer to your question, has the kind of skepticism and criticism and constant doubt that non-speaking autistic people who have found a way to communicate, I shouldn't say found, who have learned a way to communicate after much trial and many years of practice, when their abilities are doubted and you know they're not allowed access to their most effective method of communication, um, it absolutely causes real distress. And I think to your point, there are lots of different ways that people communicate. So, hopefully people can get the glass of water if they want it or whatever. But if you can't share, how you're feeling, you can't explain that you have a pain here or that, you really wish that you could go to this movie. I mean, like that's that is absolutely a fundamental human right, being able to express yourself. Um, and so when that opportunity is denied, it can cause real problems. I mean, in the community that I spend time with of non-speaking autistic folks who communicate in alternative ways, like most of them have not been, even though they might have fluency in spelling or typing, like most of them have not been provided with access to communication. They're treated as if they don't think, they're treated as if they don't understand. And how could that not take a toll on you? So that's another actually really important area of research. I think that um, some people are beginning to look at. So, for example, my friend Grant Blasco, he's a non-speaking autistic man who has talked about these kinds of issues, but also talked a little bit about the loneliness that comes from being the only user of AAC, the only typer. In his case, he types on an iPad, and like being deprived of information about other people who communicate in these ways because of various educational infrastructure, that prevents them from sharing information about other students in the same district who could ben, so like the whole system, as Grant has so eloquently explained, is set up uh, in such a way that it's not going to make a non-speaking person's life any easier. And in some ways, not intentionally, but it's making their lives much more difficult. So yeah, I think the what's the best way to say it? The failure to consider what the effects of not providing access or not allowing access to somebody's most effective means of communication, like that's a travesty, and that should not be allowed to happen. Um, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And my last sub question is what do you believe is kind of the fundamental root of I guess like exclusion of non-speaking autistic people in research in general, and then maybe also opposition to facilitate communication in particular.
Well, I think that some of it harkens back to the earlier conversation about ableist beliefs about the relationship between speech and language and being able to speak and having something to say. Um, I think um, there is genuine concern about somebody being led to say something that they don't intend to say or that could be harmful. And that I'm concerned about that too. I think that we should all be concerned about that. I think that's why the onus is on us to continue to innovate and develop ways to help people get to more levels of independence if that's their goal um, in their communication. Um, I think I can't emphasize enough, I think, how speechism, I think that's the right way to say it, a sort of belief about the supremacy of speech still is part of everything that we do and institutions that we have. And there are plenty of people who are not non-speaking autistic people, but who communicate in alternative ways for a variety of reasons, disability and personal choice, and yet there still can be um, and for those communities, right, there's excellent research, for example, that sign language is a full-fledged language and allows people to express themselves and so on. And yet, um, I think people in the deaf community would say that they often are treated as other and they are dehumanized because they don't communicate in the same way. So speechism looms large, and you see this also in the ways in which historically, like non-speaking kids and adults, like the assumption was, oh, they're just not trying hard enough, or they just need more incentive, or they need more time in order to speak. When, I think for a lot of people, like that's just not possible given their neurology and given what we know about them at this point in time. And why are we depriving them of alternative ways to communicate that they have found successful? Um, so I think many people's concerns are well intended. That is, like, we don't want um, somebody to be putting words in another person's mouth. Um, that is something that we all need to be concerned about. But as we continue to innovate and develop new methods and better ways to support people, even among those who benefit from the support of another person as they're communicating, I think we can mitigate those concerns. Um, so.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And kind of, I guess, following up what you mentioned about speechism, this is a very imperfect analogy, but I imagine that even if someone can communicate through speech, if it's much more exhausting for them, there's no reason why other methods shouldn't be equally preferred. Like personally, and this is again like not a very good equivalence, but I can talk through the phone if I absolutely have to, but I have pretty bad phone anxiety. So if there's any way to send something through email or through another method, I'll take it, every time that it's offered. And I imagine that people being pushed to speak when it's not their most natural type of communication could take a toll after a while. But that was a little bit of a digression. My last question is just, yeah, is there anything else that you'd like to add that I haven't asked about?
I don't think so, Sam. I think that you've covered a lot of the issues that I think about regularly, and hopefully we've, helped to push the conversation forward a bit with regard to, you know, some of the issues. There's a lot of research that needs to be done, but the most important thing is treating people as people and recognizing that people are different and people, as you just pointed out, are going to benefit from different kinds of support at different times in their lives. And when somebody has found a way to um, be able to participate in the way that they want to participate, why wouldn't we support them to do that? Um, so yeah, a lot of work to be done, but I'm optimistic.
Well, thank you again for your time and for sharing your research and work. I appreciate it a lot.
Oh, you're most welcome, Sam. Thanks for the invitation.